Today, we get to finish our series Encountering Jesus from the Gospel of John. And let me tell you, it's been a great journey, and I hope and pray that these lessons have been a blessing to you as they have been a blessing to me. And I hope and pray that through these lessons our faith has increased and our faith has strengthened as well. And our last character that we want to talk about is Thomas. Does everybody know Thomas? He's one of the 12 disciples who throughout church history has been commonly known as Doubting Thomas. You heard that term? Doubting Thomas? You know, of course, the nickname comes from this demand that he makes for tangible evidence in order to believe that Jesus had risen. And so his nickname is so popular today that according to the Oxford English Dictionary, anyone who refuses to believe something without proof is called a doubting Thomas. Can you believe that? Even the dictionaries, they have Thomas labeled that way. But you know what I find ironic about all this is that in the Gospel of John, and of course the other Gospels, let me tell you, Thomas was not the only one who doubted something about Jesus. That's what's ironic about this. All of Jesus' disciples, they had trouble believing in something about Jesus. All of them, for one reason or the other, they misunderstood Jesus many times as well. And so perhaps it is unfair for Thomas to be given such a bad rap. And perhaps he shouldn't be the only one with a bad rap, right? Or perhaps we need to explore other positive representations of Thomas, even in the midst of his failings. For example, in John chapter 11, verses 14 to 16, we notice that Thomas misunderstands Jesus in thinking that by all of them going to Bethany, he thinks that all of them will have to die in the hands of the Jews. And so Thomas makes this exclamation in verse 16, "Let us all go that we may die with him." And so despite his misunderstanding, I think Thomas is making a declaration here of courage. He's making a declaration of loyalty and willingness to die with Jesus. And so that doesn't seem like a guy who has the habit of doubting, right? It seems like this guy is somebody who is prepared to do what he thinks needs to be done. And a guy who thinks that what others should do as well. You know, Jesus said there in John chapter 15, verse 13, "Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends." But Thomas seems to be prepared to lay down his life for his master. And I tell you what, perhaps even better than Peter. Why do I mention Peter? Because if you recall, when Peter made the same exclamation, he got a "yeah, right" from Jesus. But with Thomas, there's no mention, there's no comment made by Jesus. Another example where Thomas failed to understand Jesus is recorded there in John chapter 14, verses 5. You know, with his pending departure, Jesus informs his disciples that he has to go to his Father's house to prepare a home for them. And he assures them that he will come back and let them know where he is going. Oh, he mentions the fact that they know where he is going. But Thomas' exclamation there in verse 5 is this: "Lord, we do not know where you're going. How can we know the way?" And so this shows that he doesn't understand what Jesus said, and he's just demanding a clarification. And see, he also thinks that the other disciples don't know either. That's why he's speaking on behalf of them as well. And so Thomas, he's showing a willingness to follow Jesus wherever he is going. He just needs a clear direction, which Jesus graciously gives him. So we can see in these two examples that John doesn't really portray Thomas as a doubter. And I believe, this is my opinion, but I believe that John portrays Thomas more like a realist or a pragmatist. A realist is someone who accepts a situation as it is and is prepared to deal with it accordingly. And a pragmatist is someone who acts in a practical or straightforward manner. So, if you look closely at Da Vinci's painting of the Last Supper, Thomas is the last figure on Jesus' right, okay? Look at the way he portrays him. He's looking intently at Jesus with his right index finger pointing in Jesus' face. You see that? Has anyone ever done that to you? Has anyone ever, just got on your face to make a point, raising their finger in emphasis? Well, when someone does that to you, you know immediately that this person is a serious person, right? Very serious. A down-to-earth person who knows the way the world is. Who has a very definite view of reality. And their intent is to make sure you see it hit their way. Their intent is for you to understand reality as they see it. So I believe that is Thomas. And so when we read in John chapter 20 that Thomas demands proof of Jesus' resurrection, it shouldn't really surprise anyone, okay? Because Thomas is being himself, a realist, a pragmatist. A realist and pragmatist, let me tell you, have a hard time believing in other people's testimony. And so they tend to doubt before believing. When it comes to anything, they need proof. And we're talking about that proof that generally, we're talking about the senses, a scientific proof. They need genuine, physical evidence of what you're trying to tell them in order for them to believe in your words. So that is one of the reasons why many people today, they don't believe in God. And they don't believe in the risen Jesus. Because they say, you know what? If you cannot give me a physical proof that he exists, therefore I cannot believe in him. Have you ever heard somebody say that? Give me proof so that I can believe. I want to see. I want to be able to touch Jesus so that I can believe. And so they demand tangible evidence. They want to see and touch like Thomas. In John chapter 20, we see that Thomas wanted to see what the other disciples had the privilege of seeing. See, this is where I see the irony about this. The other disciples, they believed because they got to see Jesus. They got to touch him. In John chapter 20, verses 16 through 18, we see that Jesus appears to Mary Magdalene. Okay? And in this encounter, Jesus tells Mary to go to the disciples and tell them that in fact, Jesus has risen from the dead and soon he will be returning to his Father. And that's what Mary did. According to verse 18, Mary Magdalene went and announced to the disciples, I have seen the Lord, and that he has said these things to her. And that is all we hear, okay? We don't hear an immediate response from the disciples. We don't don't see them jumping for joy at Mary's testimony. Why? Because they are in the same boat like Thomas. Until they see for themselves, they will believe. And see, they are operating under the same world vision that requires tangible evidence in order to believe. And so they probably thought that Mary was just imagining things. They probably thought she was under the influence of something. Or just loca de la cabeza, you know? The fact is, the disciples had other things on their mind. They were fearing for their lives. There in verse 19, the disciples are meeting together with the doors locked because they fear the Jewish leaders. So evidently they were hiding for their own safety. They feared that the Jews would come after them just like Jesus. And that's when Jesus appears out of nowhere and greets them with his Jewish traditional greeting, Shalom. Peace be with you. And then in verse 20 we see that he shows them his hands. And he shows them his side. And when they saw the marks on his hand and on his side, they knew that he was truly the one, that he was truly Jesus who had risen. They understood that he wasn't a ghost or some type of vision they were having. It was truly Jesus. He had in fact risen from the grave, but they only believed when they what? When they saw, right? When they saw his hands, when they saw his side, the disciples then were overjoyed. Their fear was gone. They could now do what Mary Magdalene did. Tell others about Jesus. Tell others that Jesus had risen. Because that was the commission they received from Jesus. And so these guys are living an amazing time. It's a great experience. You know, can you imagine all the emotions they must have felt as they see, you know, 3 days later, three days earlier, they have seen their master died, killed, crucified. They had witnessed Jesus suffering on the cross. They had seen his hands being pierced. They had seen his bloody body hanging on the cross. They had seen his dead body being taken off the cross. And now, only a few days later, he is standing right there in front of them, greeting them, and sending them out to carry out his work. And so, can you imagine all the excitement when they saw Thomas again? Thomas! You're not going to believe this, but we have seen the Lord. He spoke to us. We saw his hands and we saw his side, Thomas. They were pierced. But Thomas didn't believe their eyewitness testimony. And so he reacts like a realist, a pragmatist would react in verse 24. Now, Thomas, also known as Didymus, one of the 12, was not with the disciples when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, "We have seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see the nail." Try to imagine Thomas with his hand pointing up at their face. "Unless I see the nail marks in his hands and put my finger where the nails were and put my hand into his side, I will not believe." Do you imagine him doing that? I do. And so his demands are non-negotiable. Okay? He has to see to believe. He has to have the same experience the other disciples had. Okay? The other disciples got to see him and got to touch him. Well, Thomas wants that as well. Not only that, he has to touch him with his finger in order to believe. as well. You know, this reminds me of when I was a child and my mother would tell me not to touch the stove that was hot after she had been cooking. She told me that if I would touch that stove, I was going to burn my finger. And I was going to hurt. And it was going to be very painful. And that I was going to cry a lot. Well, of course, I didn't believe her, right? Why? Because I have to touch to believe, right? Well, I touched, and guess what? I cried. It was painful. Everything my mother told me was going to happen, it happened. So from that day, I became a believer. So in a way, I can relate to Thomas, wanting to touch. Well, we see that in verse 27. A week later, Thomas got his wish. Jesus was so gracious to grant Thomas his request. And let me tell you, Thomas responded with the greatest confession ever. If you want to hear what a great confession looks like, this is it right here. He says, "My Lord and my God." This confession is without a doubt the climax of John's gospel. Because nowhere in the gospel is Jesus called God except in the prologue, where John identifies the Logos as God. And so the word Lord is equivalent of the Old Testament word Yahweh, which is the name of God himself. And so Thomas became a believer that day. Thomas understands now that the resurrection truly shows that Jesus is in fact divine. Because only somebody who is divine is able to do that. Thomas knew that since Jesus was in fact alive, since he had risen from the dead, he had to be God himself. And so that is the understanding of Jesus that all of us, we need to arrive at. But Jesus knew. At that time, he knew that future generations of Thomases would continue to demand and see and touch. He knew that. Why? Because he's God, right? And so he makes this powerful statement there in verse 29. Then Jesus told him, "Because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." Wow. You see, this statement here is an invitation for Thomas and for all the future generations of Thomases to expand their vision of reality. A reality that is not limited by visual and tangible evidence, but can be expanded to include the invisible, the intangible, and sometimes the unexplainable. It's an invitation for future generations to see, to touch, and to experience Jesus through faith. Through faith. Through trust. Because faith and trust is what is written in his word and what is proclaimed by his disciples. You remember, that is the purpose why John wrote the Gospel of John. Remember that. We saw that in verse 30 there. Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book, but these are written so that you may believe. You see that? That is the purpose of the book. To instill faith in people. That they may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in him. his name. And so the real issue here is not simply the difficulty of believing that Jesus had risen, but also believing someone else's testimony that Jesus has risen. We all want to see Jesus. We all want to touch the physical Jesus in order to believe. And that is understandable because that was the only way the first disciples could believe. And so in a way, a person, let me tell you, has the right to choose to be a skeptic. And to remain as one all the way to their grave. They have that right. However, that right has eternal consequences. Right? But if somehow, some way the skeptic can overcome his realistic and pragmatic way of seeing things, if somehow they can overcome their doubts and believe in the testimony that has been left through the Gospels, through the Gospel of John and through the other Gospels, if they can simply believe and have faith, Jesus said that they will be blessed. Because even though they have not seen the physical risen Jesus, they have encountered him through the eyewitness accounts of those who did. And so, may the Lord give us faith. Faith. So that we can continue to see Jesus through faith. So that we can continue to touch and experience Jesus, the presence of Jesus in our life, but through faith. We need faith. Lord, give us faith. Give us faith so we can see you, Lord. So we can touch you. So we can believe in you, Lord. Give us faith so that we can have the power and the courage to share you with the world. We need faith to be able to do that. Lord, give us faith. So maybe this morning you need faith. You need faith to believe in him. You need faith to confess that Jesus is Lord. Maybe this morning you need faith to be able to accept that through baptism you can clothe yourself with Christ and you can receive the forgiveness of sins. So I stand here and I pray, Lord, give them faith. May the Lord give you faith so that you can do that. Because that is the reason why we have preached this morning. Let us stand and let us sing this invitation song. We invite you to come.
Jesus.